for some text notes on Mary E. Wilkins Freeman's A New England Nun. And hopefully you got some Story of an Hour vibes. There's a lot of parallels to the Story of an Hour in this story. Also, maybe a little bit of trifles. Um, with the women, the trifles that women concern themselves with. And so you definitely can see some parallels in those two stories here in A New England Nun. So our story begins on a quiet afternoon, much like every other afternoon that our main character, Louisa Ellis, has passed. She's sitting sewing peacefully at her window outside. You know, the day is getting ready to shut down, and the people are finishing their work out in the yard, and the cows are lowing and ready to eat, and everybody's day is coming to a close. And she's been following the same routine for every day for 15 years. Um, these domestic tasks that she takes great pride in completing in the calm and quiet of her life. It's very orderly and calm and really solitude, but she's happy with that solitude. So we find out over the course of the story that she is engaged, and the guy that she's engaged to, his name is Joe Daggett. They've been engaged for 15 years. They got engaged when 14 years ago. And Joe was like, I got to go off and make a fortune, and so that I can support you, and so he does, and he'd been gone for like the greater part of 14 years to Australia making a fortune, and she'd been behind at home, and so she's been literally waiting on him this whole time over the course of these years. um, she takes such great pride and she's so careful and consistent with these tasks that she's working on. We see her here. She's peacefully sewing at her sitting room window. And so it's the time of day. She's following the same routine. She stops what she's doing. She lays her needle, puts her needle carefully into her sewing, and she folds it precisely, lays it in a basket with all of her tools. Um, which she had never lost, by the way. It's pointed out there in that second paragraph. She had never mislaid one of these little feminine appurtenances. Appurtenances. That's a really weird word. It's very antiquated. We don't use that anymore. And that these things have just become the very part of her personality. So to lay one or mislay one by would have, gone against everything that she is. She's just got it all together, and she doesn't lose these things. This is her routine, her life. She's very consistent. And so she gets up, she goes and picks her currants for her tea, and even the process that she sits down outside and stems the currants, the little berries, and collects the stems in her apron and throws the stems into the hen coop, and making sure that there's none left behind in the grass. Everything is methodical. She's slow and still in her movements. Um she her late afternoon tea, that process is very methodical. She does it so carefully and so dutifully that it was almost like she was having guests in her home that she was preparing to entertain. It says it was set forth with as much grace as if she had been a veritable guest her own self. And she doesn't own the good china. She uses the good china every single day for every meal, which is something that her neighbors never did, because that was something you reserved for company, right? You use your paper plates when you by yourself, but you set out the good china for when you have company over so that you make a good impression. She really thrives in this environment. And it goes on there. Her fiance comes to visit, and he came twice a week without fail ever since he returned. Um, And everything in this quiet this quiet ordered solitude that she has created for herself becomes very disordered very quickly. He's got a heavy step on the walk. He's like got a loud voice, and as soon as he enters the house, all that order suddenly becomes disordered. um, it says he seemed to fill up the whole room. As soon as he walks in the door, the little canary that had been asleep in its cage begins fluttering wildly and beating its wings against the wires, just as he did every time Joe Daggett came into the room. So this happens every time this peaceful little bird who is generally sleeping and calm and quiet, just like Louisa, becomes disordered and wild and agitated. Um, and so then we see like probably what is one of the most awkward dates in the history of awkward dates. They sit there together in two chairs facing each other. She's erect. Her little hands are in her little white linen lap, it says. And then they remark about the weather. It's nice outside. Yeah, it's really nice. Have you been working today? He's like, yeah, I've been working today. It's pretty hot outside. And she's like, oh, yeah, it must be. Is your mom doing good? Yeah, mom's doing pretty good. And then they kind of run out of like things to say, like the little neighbor girl that helps their mother in the house. We'll talk about a little bit later as we kind of go along. They run out of things to say, and so he starts fiddling with stuff like all around, and he's like reaching out and moving some books around on the table. And she's watching him with uneasiness because she does everything with order. And here is this loud, heavy stepped, clumsy man who is causing all this disorder, is upsetting her bird, and now he's messing with her books that are neatly piled on the table, and he puts them down in the wrong place. And so she immediately gets up and comes over and rearranges the book. And so he doesn't really understand it. He doesn't get, sorry, I'm trying to recover from COVID. He doesn't get why she is the way that she is. He says, now what difference did it make which book was on top? And she's like, well, I always keep them that way. So, I mean, as if that's the answer to everything. And he says, you do beat everything, said Daggett, trying to laugh again. His large face was flushed. And so he doesn't understand why her life is the way that it is, why she has to be so orderly and neat. He doesn't see the difference between one way as in her way. Like, why does it matter? Why does it matter that much to her? So he stays an hour. When he gets up, he trips a little bit over the rug because he's kind of clumsy, and he hits her work basket, her sewing basket, knocks it on the floor, and everything rolls out of it. And of course, he awkwardly tries to start cleaning up, and she's like, "You know what? Just stop. I'll get him after you're gone." And so it obviously affects him because he's like, I'm nothing but a constant bother in this woman's life. And so when he gets outside, I love this. He draws in the sweet evening air with a sigh, like a relief that he is free from the house and his freedom. And he relates to like a bear in a china shop, and she relates him to a bear in a china shop on the same token as she's going around cleaning up the mess he made and sweeping up the dust he left on the floor and gets everything back to rights again. So I love this I love this kind of comparison here in this paragraph here on page 643. It says, if he would have known it, it would have increased his perplexity and uneasiness, although it would not have disturbed his loyalty in the least. He came twice a week to see Louisa Ellis, and every time, sitting there in her delicately sweet room, he felt as if surrounded by a hedge of lace. He was afraid to stir lest he should put a clumsy foot or hand through the fairy web, and he had always the consciousness that Louisa was watching fearfully lest he should. Still, the lace in Louisa commanded perforce his perfect respect and patience and loyalty. Um, it's awkward for him and he doesn't fit in. He feels out of place. He feels like he's surrounded by lace, and his dirtiness and his loudness and his clumsiness doesn't really fit in with the life that she has created. But he's loyal to her. He thinks that she deserves his respect and his patience and his loyalty, and he's going to marry her regardless. Um, because that is just what you do. This woman had waited patiently and waited quietly for him for 14 years while he was gone, and he's going to marry her regardless, even if he feels out of place around her, like he's surrounded by this lace that he can't disturb or can't break through. Um, I love this though because we see as we're moving through the story, we start to see the cracks that were kind of in their relationship from the very beginning. And we're obviously aware, obviously that they don't fit, that they're not a good match, but it it didn't always feel that way. In the length of time, much had happened. Louisa's mother and brother had died, and she was all alone in the world. But greatest happening of all, a subtle happening which both were too simple to understand. Louisa's feet had turned into a path, smooth maybe under a calm, serene sky, but so straight and unswerving that it could only meet a check at her grave, and so narrow that there was no room for anyone at her side. So 14 years ago, Louisa or 15 years ago, she had considered herself to be in love with him. She was a young girl, and she considered marriage as a reasonable feature and a probable desirability of life. And on that same token, her mother, who was the epitome of grace and a woman's role, I guess, kind of whispered in her ear that this is what it was supposed to be like, and that he was a good match, and so she had accepted his without hesitation. But what had happened in those 15 years that she spent alone in her solitude, is that her feet had turned into a path that was so narrow that there was no room for anyone at her side. And that's not a wrong thing. It's just that she had built up a life for herself apart from him, that it wouldn't matter what he had been like, she would not have been able to accept him back in. So, on his part, he had always been attracted to her. He had always thought she was pretty, had a pretty manner and soft grace, and was attractive as as a woman should be. And he leaves, and he's a little sad about leaving at first, but as he's going along, and especially when he comes back, and now that he's made his fortune, he wants it to be Louisa. He wants to that all of her waiting and all of her patience had not been kind of in vain. However, it says that it seemed to him that the song, let me find it right here. It seemed to him that the song, oh, there we go. It seemed to him that although the wind sang always that one song, the song of romance or whatever, it had another name. So what's happened is subconsciously he's realized that he is not that perfect match for Louisa. But he is bound by his honor and his duty to continue on in their relationship, even though it's whispering another name, which we know is Lily. We see that in her conversation about, oh, is Lily there taking care of your mom? And I don't know what my mom would do without her. And it wasn't some kind of subversion, like he didn't set out to try to win another woman's heart. It just kind of naturally happened because Lily and Joe are a perfect match for each other, and kind of Louisa just kind of got in the way of that. And now he's kind of bound to her, and then doesn't want to hurt her, and wants to remain loyal to her. So I'm going to stop this screencast here, and I'll pick back up with just the end, a couple more comments on the second screencast.